Hello and welcome to the first ever episode of the Pride Never Die podcast, part of the MMA Today podcast network. This new podcast is dedicated entirely to the Pride Fighting Championships. In the coming episodes, we will rewatch old Pride events, argue over the greatest fighters and fights in the promotion's history, and catch up with some of the legends that made Pride one of the most important promotions in the history of mixed martial arts. We decided to start things off on the Pride Never Die podcast with a man who has dedicated the last 2 years and more of his life to telling the definitive story of the Pride Fighting Championships, the author of the forthcoming book, Before a Fall, A History of the Pride Fighting Championships. He's Lee Daly. Lee, how are you?
I'm great, John. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. All right, let's talk about the beginning, at least for you as a fan. In my research, I read that the 2000 Openweight Grand Prix on VHS is sort of where you got started looking back at the card. It was a lot of what some people would call sort of the MO of Pride. A lot of big name former UFC fighters matched up with Japanese fighters. I thought a really genius move to sort of, by Pride, to sort of book things out. You know, the first round was for the Japanese fans, and then the belief would be the later rounds would be more for the American or non-Japanese fans. What initially drew you to Pride? What made that the thing that really caught your eye?
Well, I think it was probably the Royce Gracie and Sakuraba fight, and I think you're right. Like, particularly for that fight, I know Bas Rutten's thoughts were that they booked that fight so that they could sort of try to fill the Tokyo Dome for that round of the Grand Prix. And you know, it was obviously a ready-made attraction for Japanese fans, but yeah, I guess what was just so compelling to me about it was, you know, I was a huge pro wrestling fan at the time, and you know, I think the idea of kind of real pro wrestling and kind of these guys kind of testing each other and taking each other to the limit was really what appealed to me. You got to remember as well, like this is a time when, you know, I couldn't just switch on the TV and see UFC. You know, it wasn't really that accessible in Ireland in 2001. And yeah, for me, it was just like really captivating to just see those two guys kind of really push each other to the limit, you know. And it was also like enough of a collection of characters, I think, and interesting fights and everything else that was one of what drew me in, and that's kind of what got me interested, you know. And it's kind of persisted now ever since to this day, you know.
Yeah, I agree. I remember, you know, I had been a UFC fan for a little bit, and when that fight came about, it was like, okay, we hadn't seen Royce Gracie for a little bit. There was a lot of like different stuff that had run around, like he had lost in maybe a grappling tournament to Wally Ishmael, but he really had lost in a fight, and then this was going to be like Gracie rules, and he had all these different things that were kind of important to him, like you know, no time limits. So I remember the first time I ever watched it, it was like, okay, is this thing like is this edited? Am I going to watch the whole thing? Like there was such a mystique just around the fight with Sakuraba itself, and then you know it was kind of a defining point because moving forward, Sakuraba became this amazing character in Pride and in mixed martial arts, and Gracie had obviously been the guy who sort of set the table moving forward. For me, I had a very adversarial relationship with Pride because I was a UFC fan from the beginning, and Pride was the first real challenge to what the UFC was. You spoke a little bit about it, but what was your relationship with the UFC when you started getting into Pride?
I mean, you know, I wanted to see it very badly, but you know, at the time there was very few ways of getting it, and you know, there was VHS tapes which weren't always available. So yeah, I didn't have a whole lot of relationship with UFC, but Pride, I managed to get a hold of that because I was on tape trading networks, you know, through the sort of Japanese pro wrestling circuit, you know. So that's how I kind of got my filthy little hands on that VHS. And yeah, that was kind of it, you know. Unfortunately, yeah, the UFC at the time, I guess that would have been pretty much early Zuffa era. Actually, even a little bit before that, you know. And I'd heard of it. I think maybe my first contact was there was various video games. I think I played. There was one on the Game Boy. I think that was pretty big. But yeah, aside from that, it was really hard to access. You know, you couldn't find it in Ireland too easily. You know, and just to go back to a point actually you made about you know, kind of the Gracie rules and all this sort of stuff. I think one of the reasons why that fight is so captivating is because of the fact that it is, you know, no time limits and you know, no judges' decisions and all these kind of things. You know, historically there was in both pro wrestling and boxing going back, you know, turn of the last century, there was a lot of fights that went that long, you know, 4 or 5 hours, that kind of thing. But it's really not a thing that we see in the modern era where fights will go for that long, you know, and some may argue kind of for the better. I would argue probably for the better. the same time, I think it does. We have very much sort of lost something in terms of not having those long fights, not having the ability of a grappler to kind of get a hold of a striker and so on and so forth. So yeah, I think it's looking back on it now historically, and that's one of the reasons why I wrote the book. Um, when you assess it in that way, you do realize that there was kind of things that were, very historically significant at the time.
It's interesting that you would talk about how Pride has a lot of different things it brings to the table. Obviously, the scoring's different. Obviously, the rounds are different. It's kind of, to me, in looking back at Pride, it's always sort of been some of the best parts of other promotions. I think that's part of its appeal. It had the old school fighters, maybe a little past their prime, a little bit of the freak show nature that we see now in Bellator. It with the Shamrock Fry fights, Hoist Gracie, what was believed to be at the time a washed up Vitor Belfort, Mark Coleman, Mark Kerr, Gary Goodrich. You'd see these guys. Obviously, Hicks and Gracie started the promotion. And then it also had some of the UFC components with young fighters and just really straight ahead contenders, some of the best fighters in the world, some of the in ring craziness of Strikeforce and World Series of Fighting, just in terms of the way they would mix it up. When you think of Pride, and obviously you do often, what do you think it's most known for?
Yeah, I think it's sort of two things I would say. One would be kind of entertainment, however you want to interpret that. I think that speaks to about the freak show fights and the entrances and that kind of stuff. But I think also kind of really larger than life fights between characters, like I think Crow Cop, Fedor, Nogueira, Sakuraba, Vanderlei. There's something that's so, and I think part of that does come back to the rules and the fact that sometimes maybe these guys were matched up in fights where, they were vastly superior and they could kind of wail on guys. But yeah, I think the creation of those kind of moments, I think, is really, and they are intertwined. The ideas of kind of entertainment and of the fact that they were able to create such good characters. I think that's what the UFC now can't do. They very much set their stall out that, certainly they will to a certain extent allow fighters display personalities, and most of it's display personality that can come across in a Sports Center clip rather than do stuff like Filthy Tom Lawler would do, where he dress up as Hulk Hogan or Dan Severn. But one thing they're very definitive on, I think, is not allowing too easy of an armchair ride for fighters. You know what I mean? Like if you look at like the first CM Punk fight, right? Like he probably should have just been given a guy like Mike Jackson for that first fight rather than a guy like Mickey Gall. He still lost to Mike Jackson.
Right.
But, at least was able to make a bit more of a contest of that. I think Pride allowed itself much more latitude because I don't think they place as much store in their brand on being a sport as the UFC does. So therefore, I think that's one of the reasons why you were able to see them create these kind of crazy characters, create these kind of crazy stars. And I think that's really what we'll always remember it for, I think, is those characters like Fedor and Krokop and Wanderlei and all these guys. And yeah, I mean, they were tremendous fighters. And I think the fact that they were able to build up a reputation, personality, that's really what endured with Pride. Looking back on it, maybe it wasn't necessarily sustainable for all those reasons, but that's, I think, why it really sort of still resonates with people all these years later.
Yeah, I agree. It's kind of got, it's become sort of a cult following. It's a little bit like soccer in a way. Like it's so huge, but yet Americans never really kind of wrap their arms around it in the way that we do the UFC. The UFC seems like they're trying to make themselves smaller, and Pride was content to be big. I mean, I think they had these huge heroic performances because they were in a huge arena that was packed. There was, the announcer's some screaming lady that's just going crazy, and they have huge trophies and confetti's falling when you win. And I think that they were proud of the fact, obviously I don't say that tongue in cheek with their name being Pride, but they were proud of the fact that they had this huge event. And they only did, 34 numbered events, and they had more than that. But I think that like you said, the way it was filmed, the way that it was broadcasted, the way it was really, you have in your mind's eye a thought of like some of these really crazy performances, and some of the comebacks of Nogueira, and some of these huge, and the rule set led to like guys getting stomped out and Sakuraba flipping over everybody, and it was, I think they just left the door open to just see what was possible. So they had a lot of interesting subtext. And I want to get your thoughts on some of the things that either took away from Pride maybe or added to it. Some of the stuff like, the rumored or maybe more than rumored worked fights. Obviously, the thing between the Gracies and Sakuraba, him being the Gracie killer. There was the co-promotion with the UFC that kind of wasn't a co-promotion with the UFC, where Chuck came over and Vanderlei sort of never went back. The Crazy Horse Bennett, Vanderlei Silva backstage brawl. You know, they're kind of laissez-faireness about steroids or paying guys. You know, some of the Yakuza stuff. I mean, there's a lot of subtext with Pride. What do you think that added to it, or do you think that took from it? What's your take on some of the extra stuff?
Yeah, and yeah, the book covers actually pretty much most of that that you mentioned there. Yeah, look, I mean, I think it's you know, I think it does add to it. You know, I think it is entertaining. Obviously, from a sort of business standpoint, you know, maybe it doesn't make for the most sustainable business when you have rumors of yakuza involvement or backstage fights or whatever. I think it does, obviously makes for an interesting spectacle as MMA fans. Um, and yeah, like, I think that's one of the things that the book tries to do is it tries to sort of place all these things within a historical context. It isn't solely kind of it's more narrative based, I would say, than kind of chronologically based. I think it would have been very easy to get into a rote kind of reeling off of, well, then this card happened, then this card happened, etc., etc. But it's very much about that, about sort of looking at what you say around kind of the backstage elements of things, the different narratives going on, and sort of weaves in and out of those, rather than tries to go down through a sort of dry path of kind of recounting different stories and different tales. Um, yeah, do you want me to talk about those things you mentioned, like the Sakuraba stuff or the what have you?
Well, I mean, I more the way you covered it is perfect in the way that it was covered. I mean, I really want people to read your book. I don't want an interview to turn into what the book is ultimately. I want to direct them more towards it, and I think that's what we're doing. But that was a question I was going to ask you: is if you thought it was a more effective sort of narrative piece to write it, is the more interesting story about Pride backstage or in the ring? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it kind of combines both, and I think what will the book kind of does is I think it gives a bit of both. For people that were genuine obsessives and followed it pretty closely, I think that they will get stuff out of the breakdowns of the fights. I think for people who are maybe a bit more casual, I think particularly the last few chapters that talk about the end of the promotion, I think will be pretty fascinating, and will kind of give them a lot of it is stuff that's on the public record, but it hasn't necessarily been put into one place as of yet. And I think that reading about it and the fact that there was a lot of counter accusations, just some insanely what I would say colorful characters involved, and yeah, so I think that that's kind of what people will get out of it. I think is you'll learn something, I think, or come away from a fresh perspective on stuff you already knew.
What's something that as you yeah that's pretty fascinating. What's something that when you started researching and writing the book you thought one thing and something that completely had your mind changed in the course of writing the book? Is there something where you kind of were like, I kind of knew this for sure, had my mind made up, and the more I found out, the less I thought that.
Yeah, one of the big things I think is around Antonio Inoki. So he came into the promotion and kind of was a figure from around 2000 onwards, and there was a lot of co-promotion with New Japan Pro Wrestling, and the kind of the orthodoxy is that what happened was popularity of Pride and Inoki's kind of messing around kind of almost killed New Japan. And reality is, I think it's a little bit more complicated than that, and I think that he deserves some credit for trying to, revolutionize and modernize pro wrestling. Pride may well have kind of come along and eaten the lunch of New Japan and of pro wrestling anyway. And I think that's one thing where, yeah, I think I started out with a certain perception, and over time, kind of have changed my mind, a little bit. Aside from that, I think just overall would be I think particularly the stuff around, because I think the usual perception, and was kind of my perception going in, when you mention work fights, is there's a very strict binary between what is a worked fight and what is a shoot fight. And to be honest, like I really, the book and exploring that in more detail really kind of educated me that that's not always the case. There's very subtle ways you can favor one opponent over the other. You can tell one guy, okay, you're fighting this guy in 6 weeks, and you can tell the other guy, okay, you're fighting this guy in 2 weeks. you can come to arrangements where people don't punch each other in the face. You can tell one guy he's winning, and obviously tell the other guy that he's going to take a dive. There's a lot of different little subtle things you can do, and for me, I think it really kind of illustrated that there is a lot of different ways to manipulate things, and as much as we want to believe that fights are always either strictly on the level or are sort of fully kind of fake or whatever, there's a much more of a spectrum, and I think that's one thing that I got out from the book, and one thing I didn't necessarily know going in.
I think it gets tricky with some of those work fights because a lot of guys' legacies are maybe not totally tainted, but they are affected by some of the rumors from the Pride fights. I would say Vanderlei Silva, Fedor, those are people have tried to poke holes in their legacies based on that. But I mean, you look at a guy like Vanderlei Silva. I mean, he's taken out Sakuraba. Maybe he would be open to fighting a worked fight, but I mean, Dan Henderson, Rampage Jackson, these aren't guys you would typically think would take a fall or whatever. So do you think that by and large, through your research, the promotion was largely on the level?
I think so. I think for the big matches between two guys where they would want to, draw crowds, I think the likes of maybe Wanderlei versus Rampage, or Krokop versus Fedor, or Nogueira versus Fedor, or these kind of things. Yeah, I think by and large it probably was on the level. I think with other fights, yeah, there's certainly a case that they got a bit of an armchair ride, but they also fought on a hell of a lot of times. So when you look at guys like fighting 3, 4, maybe even 5 times a year, which I don't think is done as much this year. I think that typically you're looking at between 2 or 3, and I think anybody that's over that is really very active. And so for me, I think that you can, and it's hard to assess, obviously, because we don't always know. I think you can assess some of these guys as being amongst the greatest. I think if you look at what they did after the after Pride, I think that's a good way of evaluating people. Like I think Nogueira and Shogun Hua both acquitted themselves really well in the UFC. They weren't able to hold the titles that they won necessarily, but they did do pretty well, and that was after taking pretty considerable punishment in Pride. I think Wanderlei was on his way out at the end of Pride anyway, and that process accelerated in the UFC. But even someone like Fedor, yeah, he's definitely lost a few matches in Bellator, but he's held up well too. It's strange in that sense. So I think we are able to assess and kind of say, look, these guys, it was the premier mixed martial arts promotion at the time. All things being equal, those were the best fighters in the world at the time. I think maybe aside from sort of Randy Couture, or maybe Chuck fighting a little bit more over there. I think that's fairly inarguable. And as a result, yeah, I think the champions in particular, I think both Fedor and Wanderlei, who obviously were dominant in their weight classes for so long, I ain't so sure I would quibble too much with them, being amongst the greatest of all time. Even despite the fact that there are a lot of other factors to consider.
Yeah, and obviously, the shot in the arm that the Pride purchase gave to the UFC, and also the Strikeforce purchase. But the Pride, when those guys came in, it was like, you brought Henderson and all these, Rampage came right in and knocked out Chuck, and like you said, Shogun grabbed a belt. Nogueira was an interim champion. I mean, these guys came in and made an immediate impact. So it's not like, they, even Vanderlei, he put on a great fight with Chuck. He put on a great fight with Brian Stan. I mean, there were some great fights that Vanderlei came in and had. So you talked to a lot of people in the process of writing this book. It's documented, obviously, on the website, some of the guys you talk to. When you talk to them, do you get the feeling they miss it and they wish it were still around, Pride Fighting Championships? Or do you think it's kind of like, when a guy's married and he used to be single, he remembers his single days, but he's like, he's kind of moved on from it?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think everybody has a certain nostalgia for it. But yeah, I wouldn't necessarily say that they wouldn't necessarily miss it. To be honest, now I didn't talk to some of the big fighters. It was very hard to get hold of them. A lot of them are still fighting, and they're in camps, so it's quite difficult to pin them down. But certainly from the people that were in and around it, I think like the likes of Boss Reed and Stephen Quadros, I don't sense that there's a huge desire to go back there, and relive that. Especially some of the stuff, I think the physically punishing, stomps and that kind of thing, and soccer kicks. I don't think that's something that people want to return to necessarily. what I think there is, and I would make this argument pretty strongly, is I think there's a real desire for a sort of large and viable alternative. Not just for the fans, but for the fighters as well. I think UFC, as you talked about in terms of acquiring Strikeforce and Pride, all this kind of stuff, they've put themselves in a real like monopolistic position, and that can be tough on fans, and I think it's tough on fighters too because they don't have the same amount of leverage that they would have had otherwise. So I think that, yeah, and also the other factor as well is like, look, there's Ryzen is still there. I think if and I would even say like a lot of people who are Pride fans don't necessarily seek out Ryzen, and maybe they should, and it's there and it provides pretty much most of what Pride did. Now it doesn't have the same level of star power, at least not yet. There may be a time when they're able to create that, but especially in a time when those fights are available pretty easily, they're streaming, live. People can access them on Fight TV and these other channels. I think that if people support it, it will probably be more of a viable alternative otherwise. And yeah, like it's there. It has a lot of the same feel to it. It has a lot of the same people involved in it, right down to Lena Hart, the ring announcer. And yeah, like I think that's why people can, if they want to indulge in that nostalgia and indulge in that, I think that's where they can go to.
A part of I think acquiring Pride, Strikeforce, and WEC. I mean, you want to get the fighters, you want to get the guys into your thing. But the other part of it is now that we see with Fight Pass. I mean, that's where the libraries are all located, and they built the largest library of fights ever based on acquiring all these things. So I guess my final question, and we'll talk a little bit about the fights, maybe it's some bonus content. But my final couple of questions, the one here is, do you think that the Pride brand has any value to the UFC moving forward? Meaning, could it be relaunched as Pride, owned by Zuffa, or not owned by Zuffa, but now WME and that whole group, but owned by the UFC, but under the Pride banner? Do you think that would be a more viable product than just the UFC going there as the UFC into those markets?
Yeah, look, I think so, and I think that's really something that they should try. I think they gave up on the Pride brand purely because they couldn't find a TV deal. They found it really difficult to negotiate the Japanese market after Pride collapsed. They had sort of uncooperative staff. Television executives didn't really want to hear from them because the Pride brand had been fairly tinted by some investigative articles into the Yakuza links. And yeah, look, I think it would be a good idea. And I mean, look, no more than holding Strike Force nostalgia shows in the Bay Area, would be a good idea. I think though that the UFC are so, because of the fact that they set out their stall, and Lorenzo Fertitta even said this, that he had purchased the brand UFC. They've put so much stock into, it's going to be the UFC. That's how it's going to be packaged, and that's what's going to grow. And yeah, look, there might be some markets where they could perform better if they did kind of localization through calling it Pride. But I think they're willing to take that on the chin purely because they want to keep the notion of UFC as the strong brand, going. So yeah, look, it's something I'd be interested in, something I'd love to see, but unfortunately, it doesn't seem likely. And if you even look at the shows they do run, I think there is a bit of a willingness to have some of the crazy element, like the likes of kind of booking Rin Nakai, or whomever onto those shows. But yeah, I think by and large they're not. They want to keep it pretty much, as they do, and they're also not that keen on expending much overhead in terms of crazy entrances or all that kind of stuff.
Finally, let's talk about the lasting legacy of Pride. When you think about Pride, and when you think most fans think about Pride, what do you think their lasting legacy is? And when people read your book, what do you want them to walk away with? If a guy came up to you or you went to Amazon and someone reviewed the book, what would be your indication? Okay, this guy got it. He kind of understood where I was coming from.
Hmm. Uh, I guess to answer your last question first, I think what I'd like people to come away with is, whether they're MMA fans or not, is just how significant Pride was. Because I think it's so easy to forget that, because it has disappeared so quickly and thoroughly from the scene, when it was at one point the high watermark for MMA fans. So I think coming away from it with an understanding of just how big it was, why it was big, and maybe some of the more the details, particularly around the fights, I think that would be if I can communicate that, I'd be very happy. What was the first part of your question again? Sorry, was
Lasting legacy for Pride.
lasting legacy. Yeah, look, I think it's I think it is those fights. I think it is that content, that's there on Fight Pass. It'll never be repeated. In some cases, rightly so, because of the damage that people took. But it was a crazy time. It was huge attendances, the likes of which we don't see regularly in the UFC. And yeah, I think that'll be the legacy of it. Will be gifting those memories, gifting those fights, and I think demonstrating. The truth is, the UFC has become a valuable proposition, a valuable brand because of the sports element of it. But ultimately, what people remember and what makes MMA big and what draws people to it is actually the same thing that drew people to Pride. It is colorful characters like Conor McGregor, your Chael Sonnens, your Ronda Rouseys. You can't do that every week, even though the UFC has to produce content every week. But that's, I think, what Pride's legacy is that it really demonstrated that to get people interested, that's what you need. You need to have crazy characters and you need to have outrageous fights and all this kind of stuff. And I think ultimately that's what its legacy is going to be.
In an odd way, we've talked about some work fights and things. I think another one of its legacies is just a weird, like an authenticity. I think because it was so raw, even though they were not adverse to putting on, some pomp and circumstance. I mean, when you see a guy like Shogun flying through the air, kicking some guy in the face. I mean, that's real, and that was, I think, the draw of the early UFC times, was there was an authenticity. Now, can you keep kicking guys in the face that are grounded opponents forever? No. I mean, obviously, at some point you have to seek regulation, especially in the States. But I do think there was an authenticity to it. I do think that guys really were bringing it, and I think that kind of is, like you said, sort of what the content is there. So yeah, for sure. So all right. We're going to have Lee stick around for some bonus content here in a sec. But for now, let's get out of here on this. Tell the folks what can we do, what can they do to get this book on the shelves that it needs to be on? What can folks do to help out? Where can they follow you? Where can they learn more about the book? What's our action steps, Lee?
Yeah, so here comes the plug part, right? Where everybody was waiting for. Beforefallbook.com. That's where the Indiegogo is. So if you go there and become a backer, you can receive a kind of limited edition copy of the book. You can get the ebook for €10, hard copy for 20, both for 30, and then a signed copy for 40. So sorry, euros, not dollars, I should say. And then we've got some cool packages above that if you're a collector and you really want to get a unique sort of memorabilia from Pride. We have this really cool illustrator, John Sheehan, who's done the illustrations for the book, and he's gonna do some prints for us. So beforefallbook.com is where people can go. For Twitter and Facebook, it's twitter.com/beforefallbook. And then for facebook.com, it's the same. It's facebook.com/beforefallbook. There are, as we record this, 7 days to go. I'm sure it'll be a little less time by the time this comes out. But yeah, if people could head on over there and support, I'd really appreciate it.
Absolutely. There you have it, folks. Follow the man, support his book. Make sure you join us for the upcoming episodes of the Pride Never Die podcast here on the MMA Today Podcast Network. And we're going to have Lee stick around for a little bit of bonus content, just where we talk a little bit about more in-ring stuff and get his thoughts on what Pride's in-ring legacy is. So, again, follow him and support his book. And we'll catch you on the next episode of the Pride Never Die podcast. Take it easy.